Probably most people are. Okay, this report. Um, all right, so for those of y'all who don't know, I'm Dalton. I am the secretary for HLCS. I really appreciate everyone hopping out on this and joining us. We've got a couple talks for us, and then at the end, so each talk will be 10, 15 minutes. Got 3 of those, and then the last 15 minutes or so, we'll just kind of use for some open questions, open discussion, kind of free form. All right, so we'll go ahead and start then. So first we have Nathan Rains. He's a wildlife diversity biologist with Texas Parks and Wildlife. And go ahead, take it away.
All right, thanks, Dalton. Let me see if I can share my screen again. Can y'all see it okay?
Looks good.
Okay. I just want to give you all a quick update on kind of what we've been doing this year. I see a lot of familiar faces and names on this meeting. So some of y'all are probably familiar with what's been going on, with this project as a whole over the past really nearly 15 years now. So it's been a collaborative effort between Texas Parks and Wildlife and TCU and the Fort Worth Zoo, initially in the Dallas Zoo, and the Caldwell Zoo kind of came online this year with us. And just want to give you all kind of quick update what's going on. Y'all are probably familiar with kind of what's been happening, I assume, and we don't have time to go through the whole project. Really, we started back in 2007 having our initial conversations about this, and it was all kind of born out of that whole idea of people and landowners asking what happened to horned lizards and can you bring them back. So that was kind of the genesis of this whole project. And if you're not familiar with kind of the project as a whole, I'll be glad to visit with you later on at some point. You can call me and we'll be glad to give you an update. But kind of where we're at right now in 2021, we just this month and last month released 261 hatchlings out at Mason Mountain Wildlife Management Area. And if you're not familiar with, that's one of our kind of research and demonstration areas down in the hill country, just north of the town of Mason. We released 200 hatchlings kind of mid-September and another 59 just here recently. The reason we release them in 2 batches like that, it's just because of the logistics of when those babies are born at the zoo. They don't all hatch at the same time. Some of these come out of secondary clutches. So that's kind of why we every year have to kind of release them in 2 batches. And we're releasing them in 2 separate sites or plots on the WMA. These are pretty close to each other. They're adjacent, but they're have some differences in habitat. And we've really been looking at kind of monitoring what are the differences of those releases. Is there any difference in habitat? Is there any difference in our release methodology? One of the plots, we release them in clusters of about 30 lizards, like that would mimic, them coming out of a clutch in the ground. And then the other plot, we disperse them every 5 meters to just kind of mimic, natural dispersal. And we've got the 3 grad students, I think, on this call, so they might can expand on some of the results. But this is actually our 5th year to release hatchlings. We've released approximately 60 in 2017, and in 2018 and 19, that number grew to about 130, 135 in that neighborhood. And in the last 2 years, we released a little over 250. So it's been kind of an incremental increase over time. And ultimately more would be better, but there's been some challenges of breeding lizards in captivity, breeding a few pairs. It's not too difficult, but when we've tried to do this on almost like a commercial scale, it becomes challenging. We could have a whole other talk on some of the challenges of husbandry. But so this is our 5th year to really release hatchlings out there. Some of the exciting things we found this year is our grad students have found 23 hatchlings so far that were actually born on the WMA. These were hatchlings born this late summer and fall that were their parents were hatchlings that we captive bred hatchlings we released on the WMA 2 or 3 years ago. So we're getting reproduction out of the hatchlings that we reintroduced to that site. So, ultimately that's the goal. We would love to have these lizards live as long as possible, but in reality, if we can get these lizards to live a couple years old to reproduce, then then we're kind of creating the next generation of lizards on the ground. So that's really the ultimate goal of what we need to accomplish with these lizards. So we're seeing that. We're seeing reproduction. We're seeing carryover. We've also found that these hatchlings can potentially reach adult size in 1 year. And I'll be the first to admit I was skeptical of that. I know I've seen it in the literature, but when we went out there and found some of these adult sized lizards, and then Rachel and some of the WMA staff are saying, these are the ones we released last year's babies. And I was like, there's no way. But sure enough, they're reaching that adult size in 1 year, which means the next spring they could be reproducing out there. So quicker that happens, the better, obviously, because kind of accelerates the process. So that was pretty exciting to see. I just want to introduce our 3 grad students that are working on this project this year, because they're doing all the work out there. So it's Rachel, Elenis, well, it's not Elenis anymore. She's married now. And then Patrick and Pedrick. Rachel's a PhD student, and y'all can read that's her title for dissertation. And Patrick and Pedrick are both master's students, and this is their thesis projects. But basically, Rachel's looking at kind of comparing those 2 sites that are out there. What are the differences in those sites? She's looking at the ant communities and the doing that to some pretty neat stuff with some basically test tube pitfall traps out there to look at the different ant communities, which has been really beneficial to us. She's looking at the microbiomes of the diets of these lizards, and looking at some of the weight gains we see, growth rates in these lizards. Pedrick's looking at classifying some of the ground cover percentages out there. As you know, that's pretty important. And then Patrick's looking at thermal habitat selection. So these pictures kind of show you what happens in this whole reintroduction process. You've got the whole media at the front end of it, and then the back end of it actually put lizards on the ground. So as you all know, whenever we do stuff like this, it generates a lot of interest with media and social media and just people in general. Just some photos. This is some of Pedrick's work with looking at the ground cover percentages. You can see his meter square there to measure those differences in those compositions. As in our last meeting, Ray Moody made a good point of how important bare ground is in horned lizard habitat, and y'all are all familiar with that. This right picture has a lizard with a transmitter right in the middle. You can barely see it. And then some of Patrick's work is one of the lizards that grew to adulthood. It's got no longer has a harmonic radar, but kind of graduated to a regular traditional radio telemetry. And then some of his kind of climate thermal data loggers here, they're shaped like lizards, pretty neat stuff. And then Rachel's out there with doing the bulk of this tracking. Look at, our babies have the harmonic radar that Ray Moody was really instrumental in kind of pilot testing that technology, and we really piggybacked on that. So it's not perfect, but it's way better than we've ever had before. But we can finally, really for the first time, follow hatchlings and juveniles and see what happens. There's really no mechanism to do that before, so it's pretty amazing technology. Here's just some of Rachel's data, and she's on here, and I think Patrick are too, if they want to jump in at the end if we have time and kind of talk about the survival rates of our hatchlings. On one of our sites, the survival rate over the 2 years has been better than the other site, and that's with us flip-flopping those kind of ways we release those lizards. So kind of our initial knee-jerk reaction is that the means of reintroduction or putting lizards on the ground really doesn't matter so much. It's more of a function of the habitat and the prey base there. And our estimates of survivability are kind of falling in line with what we see in the wild. Y'all are probably all familiar enough with horned lizards to know that they have really low annual survivability. So and I don't know if we have enough data to really make assumptions yet, but we're probably looking at between 10 and 20% survivorship, which is kind of falls in line with what's out there in the wild. And there's been studies on obviously adult lizard survivorship. There's really never been anything done on hatchlings because in the wild there's no way to track those. Obviously, we're doing it now with harmonic radar, but that's fairly new technology. It just wasn't available in the past, and so really looking at survivorship of hatchlings is almost we don't have the ability to do that in the wild. So just some of our partners, I want to acknowledge all them. It's it's the staff at Mason Mountain, Mark Mitchell, who's the lead biologist there, and then Dr. Jim Gallagher, who's our research biologist on the site, been helpful to our students out there on the ground. Forward Zoo has been one of our partners from the very beginning, since the inception of this whole thing, and it's Diane Barber and her staff. Dallas Zoo has been very helpful. They've been using a little bit different protocol or methodology in what they're doing. They're instead of breeding lizards in captivity, they're going out every early summer and they're collecting gravid females from the wild, from out in West Texas, from one of their research sites, and they're bringing them back, letting the lizards lay eggs, and then they're incubating those clutches, but then taking the adults back to where they got them from. So that's been real helpful the last couple of years. And then the Caldwell Zoo has just come online this last year and produced a couple clutches for us. So moving forward, Fossil Rim, y'all are probably familiar with that organization. They're interested in joining this as well as some other potential partners. So every year this project grows. The San Antonio Zoo is doing their thing too, and we're all working towards the same goal. We're all on the same team. But the more partners we have, the better it'll be, because with horned lizard reintroduction, it's kind of plainly clear it's going to take a whole bunch of lizards on the ground to get a self-sustaining population. So the more partners we have, the more lizards we can produce, obviously. So that's what we're working towards, and I'm pretty excited to see what we've got. So I'm glad to answer a few questions if y'all have them. I know we've got our students on here too if they want to jump in, and I know we got some free time at the end if we want to come back to it. So just be glad to visit however I can about it.
Yeah, appreciate it. We've got 3 minutes or so for any specific questions. And if not, I mean, we can wait till the end, whatever, if anyone has any specific questions. So I actually did have a question myself. So I know you talked about you're able to estimate survival rates. Y'all probably don't have enough time or haven't gone through enough years to estimate recruitment of juveniles yet. Maybe have y'all been able to do that, or is it's just the one generation so far?
Rachel, you want to jump in? I mean, this is our first year to find actual recruitment from reintroduced lizards. We found a few over here and there over time from adults we've transplanted. That was before we went kind of the route of hatchlings. We looked at the feasibility of translocating adults, and that worked pretty well. Except for that, you just feasibly can't catch enough adults to put on the ground. So that's why we kind of evolved to using captive bred hatchlings. I mean, you either catch 50 adults in the wild, or you can produce 500 in theory in captive environment. So that's why we did this. So this is the first year we've seen recruitment from captive bred hatchlings we've reintroduced, but that's really because we've only gone back a couple of years to have enough time to do that. So pretty small sample size.
I think the other thing to keep in mind is that finding those hatching babies is really difficult. So for every one that I find, there's probably 2 to 4 that I don't find. So actually estimating recruitment would be extremely difficult just because they obviously don't have tags on them. So locating them there's some challenges there.
Right.
So Rachel's putting tags when we do find them, but like she said, these are wild born. So there's no, they're coming out of the ground, with no tracking on them at all. So it's hard.
Right. All right. Well, okay, we can go ahead and move on then. Thanks for answering my question. Again, we've got time at the end for more. So next will be Ariana Duffy. She is a keeper at the San Antonio Zoo. Yeah, she is right there. Okay.
Go ahead. Okay, can everyone hear me and see my screen? Great. So like you said, my name is Ariana Duffy, and I am a conservation and research technician at the San Antonio Zoo. And since our project is a lot younger, I will actually be able to kind of give an overview of the whole project itself. And Mason, if you're watching, yes, that is a photo of Agnes. So I'm just briefly going to give a description as to why horned lizard populations have declined. It's multiple reasons. One reason is overcollection for the pet trade. Unfortunately, in that left-hand side photo, that is actually a website which at some point in time you could log on and actually purchase a horned lizard. Nice to see that it's listed as sold out. And yeah. Another major factor for their decline is the eradication of harvester ants. That's their primary diet source, and due to overuse of pesticides, as well as fire ants that tend to be extremely aggressive and overtake their mounds, their populations have declined as well. And in that top right side chart, you can see there's a correlation between the type of ant present as with the amount of lizards present. And lastly, the fire ants are extremely aggressive in that they will attack the eggs themselves. And in this photo, this is some chicken or bird egg, and you can see they're doing extreme amount of damage, so let alone what they would do to a much smaller lizard egg that doesn't have that kind of hard shell. So we are permitted under Texas Parks and Wildlife to collect individuals of the southern genetic variety. So we're basically focused on the region that's south of the Colorado River and all the way west to Valverde County. So as Nathan mentioned, all of the other zoos are working with the northern variety. When we have individuals, we will bring them back to our lab at the zoo, which is climate controlled and basically outfitted with everything the horned lizards need for survivability. We have UV lamps, heat lamps, automatic misters, and I don't know if you can really see very well in the photo. In the top one, we made these ant feeders that kind of stimulate an actual ant mound, and they're pretty helpful too because the ants don't just get scattered everywhere. So the next step is breeding the lizards. And we've actually learned a lot over time. Initially, we would place the pairs together and leave them together anywhere between a few days to a week. But we noted that successful copulation usually occurred within the first 30 minutes. So now we tend to only leave them together just for a few hours. And some signs that we know that show that they're interested in each other is they will bob their heads, they'll wag their tails, they'll lick the sand, they'll lick each other. So we can kind of get an idea if there's interest even beforehand. And in the top left photo, you can see the male is grabbing onto the female's horns. They'll bite down just to kind of get a good grasp. And typically males are smaller than females. So in the right side photo, you can see the male is redder and he's on top of the female. And that's not even that huge a stark difference. We actually have some males that are very, very small compared to the females. And it is amazing how they just hang on. It's like watching someone riding a bucking bronco as the females try to throw them off. So yeah, they manage despite their smaller size. We do face challenges, however, because we can't force the lizards to mate with each other. If they don't want to, there's pretty much nothing we can do to change their minds. And also it's pretty hard to tell if the females are actually gravid. Short of taking x-rays, we really don't know only up until they start laying the eggs. We tend to notice a bit of a behavioral change prior to them laying eggs, which is usually a couple of days before they'll start digging the sand much more intensely than they usually do. And in this photo, the left-hand bottom photo, you can see the female is digging she reached all the way to the bottom of the glass tank, and this is about 4 inches of sand that's in there. And a few days later, she laid the eggs that you can see in the right side photo. Now, typically they will bury their eggs, but we've kind of noticed it tends to vary a lot how we find them. Sometimes we find them on the surface, like in that photo, and other times we do have to sift through the sand to find them. So we're not really sure why they lay them one way versus another. Once the eggs are laid, we'll collect them and we place them in these incubation boxes, which have temperature and humidity controlled. The eggs are placed in the boxes on the top left side photo, and then those boxes are placed in the incubation boxes underneath in the photo. And the hatchlings usually take about 2 months to hatch. And in the right side photo, you can see they're starting to emerge. For us, the ideal age that we want to release the offspring is between 3 to 6 months of age, because at this point they're large enough where they can eat the ants and large enough where they're less likely to be predated on, but also young enough where they're not imprinted by people. And we've actually noticed some of our adult breeders, when we feed them crickets, we tend to just tap a container of the crickets over the top of their tank, and they actually know to look up expecting their food. So we really don't want to release a bunch of little lizards that are going to expect their food to fall from the sky. And in the right side photo is just one of our lizards eating ants from one of our feeders. When the time comes to release them, we are releasing them on suitable privately owned property. So there are certain criteria that a land needs to meet in order to have lizards released on it. It needs to be a certain amount of acres, at least 200 acres, that is. It needs to have a good variety of vegetation, including open and shaded areas, and then an abundant amount of harvester ant mounds. If fire ants are present, that doesn't necessarily exclude a property, but it does need to be controlled with non-chemical means. And I know that sounds like an oxymoron right there. How do you control fire ants in a non-chemical way? And so in the bottom right photo, you can see Dr. Andy Glusenkamp actually devised this. It's a pressure washer, which basically with the wand, you insert it into the fire ant mound and blast extreme heat and pressure and soap. And that's a really effective way of killing the fire ant mounds. Also, by releasing lizards on privately owned property, it's a great way to engage the community. The current ranch in Blanco County underwent restoration for about 3 years prior to the release, and that involved doing a survey of the landscape, of the vegetation, fire ant control, other pest control. And so by maintaining land and getting an interest from the public, we're encouraging people to try to have their land in better conditions, which will not only benefit horned lizards, but also a plethora of biodiversity. And so the property that we released on is actually 250 acres, but the total land available is 2,000 acres. Our first release occurred in October of 2020, and the lizards range from 3 months to 3 years of age. Now, I know I initially said our goal was to release lizards from 3 to 6 months. However, it took us several years of trial and error to really understand the best breeding strategies and husbandry protocols. So we didn't want to have our first release with just several. We wanted to make sure we had enough to release to ensure that there would be a good amount of genetic diversity. And in the left side photo, you can see those are all the lizards. We have them in their individual transport containers when we brought them to the site. And the photos on the right are of the actual release. The lizards were released in groups of 5 to 6 individuals, and they were placed down in close proximity to a harvester ant mound, but also with vegetation, some kind of shrubbery nearby. And the goal is to release 300 lizards over the course of 3 years on the same property, and then an additional 25 a year for another 2 years, just to make sure we have a good amount to have a viable population. The second release we did on the same property occurred just earlier this month, and this was a release of 23 lizards. While this was a lot less than the first release, we actually were much more successful with in-house breeding this season. And that's because we think now that we weren't keeping the pairs together for as long, we were reducing unnecessary stress and possible competition for food between the adults. Also, we made a lot of husbandry changes, the addition of the automatic misters versus hand misting, the addition of extra supplementary ants seems to have been made great improvements as well. When we released the lizards, we would take photo IDs of their bellies because the spots on their bellies are sort of equivalent to the human fingerprint, where no two lizards have the same spot assortment. So if we do find them again, we can match them up and we can determine which individual it is. And also the photo serves as a GPS location of exactly where we released them. So once we release them, it's really hard to spot them. And there is one lizard in this photo. I had placed it down. I don't know if you can spot it. I guess try. But yeah, I set it down. I stood up, took a step back, looked away, looked back, and I couldn't find it. But it's right there. Congratulations to those who did spot it. And since that one was easy, this one will be a little harder because we not always have open ground. Now we have vegetation to contend with. And the little guy is there, sneaky lizard. So how do we plan on finding them again? Some of the methods that other institutions have used are harmonic radar and radio telemetry. Unfortunately, these have their downsides as well. One of the reasons being that the diodes and the tags hanging could theoretically hinder their movements as well as attract predators. Personally, if any of my cats came across the little guy in the top photo, that lizard would not stand a chance. And another challenge is just a lot of manpower combing through the area. Since those scanners don't have that large a range, it takes a good amount of effort for people to be out there. So we wanted to try something a little different. Oops. We plan to utilize lizard detection dogs. So we've partnered with Paul Bunker of Chiron Canine. He's a professional dog trainer, and we're training a team of canines as well as their handlers to detect horned lizards by scent. And we'll have the dogs train on lizard scat, shed skin, and actual lizards too. And in the top photo, you can see this is a training session with one of the dogs where a sample is placed inside one of the containers and the dog has to successfully locate it. And we do these trials over and over again. And the bottom photo is horned lizard scat that was found in the wild. It's not always feasible though to do training with a live lizard. So Paul Bunker has actually implemented this device that you can see in the bottom left side photo. It's a chamber and the lizard is placed inside of it. And then with the flow of air and the moisture, the scent of the lizard is absorbed onto a gauze pad. And then this gauze pad can later be used for training purposes. Unfortunately, we haven't actually found horned lizards yet with the dogs. We have had some promising results where they've located scat that we think might be horned lizard scat, and we're sending that out to determine if it is indeed. The last component that I'm going to discuss of the project is public outreach and education. So we will go out and just engage the community and just try to spread the message of conservation of horned lizards and good land stewardship. On the left side photos was an event we did at Schertz Park where we would go out with a few horned lizards and just describe the project and then collect some ants that they had available and hand out some materials for them to just learn more about it. And on the right side is the launch of the newest Freetail Conservation beer can, which features a horned lizard. And I don't want to sound like I'm advertising, but if you buy a can of that beer, some of the money will go to horned lizards. And they did a photo shoot with one of our horned lizards, Betsy. She looks great there. And that is it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We've got about a minute. If anyone has a quick specific question.
Hey, Ariana, I have just a quick question. One of the kind of challenges that we had this year was we got a lot of eggs. I mean, all the zoos up here working with the northern form, but a lot of them just didn't hatch. Did y'all have issues like that this year with just, either infertile or eggs that just did not hatch for whatever reason?
Yeah, we did. We had we had actually, it was pretty odd. We had one female lay about 10 eggs, and then 2 days later, she laid another 15 eggs, and most of those didn't end up surviving. And it just seems we had a lot more eggs laid than what was actually successfully hatched.
Yeah, us too. We don't really know why, honestly.
Yeah, it's some of them just kind of start getting moldy, some of them start shriveling up, and there's no real good way to tell why.
All right. Thank you, Ariana. And finally, Dean Williams, professor at TCU. You ready?
Yes.
All right, let's do this.
Share my screen. Let's see. Okay. Everybody hear me okay? Okay. So today I just want to give some kind of broad overviews of stuff my lab has been involved in as far as horned lizards are concerned. First thing I talk a little bit about is Texas horned lizard genetics, what the implications were for captive breeding and reintroductions. And then I want to wrap it up talking about our work down in South Texas, looking at horned lizards living in small towns. And specifically, the big question there was, how can they coexist with people when they've disappeared in so many other places? So, why do we do genetics? There's two big reasons. One is, when you do a reintroduction project or a captive breeding project, you want to avoid inbreeding depression. So you want to make sure there's enough genetic diversity there to avoid that. And also to make sure that there's enough raw material genetically that when conditions change, which they always do, diseases come through or changing environmental conditions, that they'll be able to adapt, that some individuals will have the right genetic constitution to make it through whatever changes pop up. And then the second reason is to try and figure out where the origins of these lizards are and whether or not there are distinct genetic clusters of Texas horned lizards. And if that's the case, then you might want to keep lizards in their region of origin to try and maintain, again, adaptations that they may currently have to those particular environments, and not be mixing them up with other populations that may not have those adaptations, and may not survive as well. So we've done this across Texas and some neighboring states, and it turns out there's three main genetic clusters. There's a western one, which you can see here in these red marks here along the map up through New Mexico and then very far west Texas. There's a northern cluster, what we're calling the northern one, which is the little gray circles, and that occurs over most of the range. And then there's a southern cluster that's south of the Edwards Plateau. Recently, I've been involved in another study that used next generation sequencing to look at horned lizards over an even larger area. It included Oklahoma and Kansas in that study. And you find the same three clusters. You find the southern cluster in southern Texas, you find a big northern cluster, and then you find a far western cluster. And what was interesting from that study is you can use that data to try and figure out, do you see signatures of selection in these different groups? And you do, actually. In this case, the signature that kept popping out was associated with precipitation levels. So those three clusters that you see there, the western one really is more of a desert cluster, and then South Texas, of course, very different from more northern Texas. Precipitation levels are very different, in those various areas. And it looks like horned lizards may have genetic adaptations to those differing precipitation levels. And so that would be another argument for not, for instance, moving lizards from South Texas into North Texas or west into north, or moving them around that way, or crossbreeding them between these clusters, because then they may not have the right basically genetic mix to survive well in those habitats. So these clusters really, they correspond to different ecoregions in Texas. And as a result now, those are being kept separate, in terms of reintroduction as well as breeding. The Fort Worth and Dallas zoos are mainly specializing in breeding the northern cluster. And then the San Antonio Zoo that we just heard about is concentrating on breeding southern lizards. So from that cluster, and that's where those will be reintroduced. We also found, this is a measure of genetic diversity here, average allelic richness of horned lizards in these different sites across Texas. The green bars are all protected areas, and you can see that all of those bars are higher than the other bars there. Those gray bars are all small towns or small areas in town, like Tinker Air Force Base. And then one is a protected area, Matagorda Island, but it's an actual island, barrier island. And so it looks like, in terms of getting individuals for captive breeding or reintroduction, getting lizards from protected areas really is the best thing because they have the highest genetic diversity. Getting lizards from places like small towns, even though they may be at high density in those areas, which I'll talk about in a little bit, would not be so great because they have significantly lower genetic diversity. They're more isolated, probably more inbred actually. And so those would not be good for reintroductions. They're very similar to an actual island. So you can see the blue bar there is very similar to those gray bars. We've done some modeling to try and figure out, how many individuals would need to be released to maintain genetic diversity. The early modeling suggests about 300 hatchlings, which Marianne mentioned in her talk. And then supplementing that every couple of years with 25 to 50 individuals. We need to update that modeling now that Rachel and crew have better estimates on hatchling survivability and stuff. We were just guessing before pretty much putting those values in. But now we need to put in some more real values and see, if this result kind of holds now that we have a better handle on what survivability is that first year and the first month and so on. And, Nathan mentioned this already, but currently Rachel's doing her PhD work, mainly with hatchling Texas horned lizards, the ones that were released, as well as ones that were born there naturally. And then Patrick and Patrick are both looking at different aspects of habitat use of Texas horned lizards. And they're doing that at Mason Mountain. And the other cool thing is there's a ranch nearby there. Brian Wright runs that ranch. It's the White Ranch. It's in the same ecoregion. And there's a natural population of horned lizards there. So it kind of provides a nice comparison between the captive bred and released horned lizards versus ones that naturally occur in that habitat. And we'll be able to make some neat comparisons between home range use and habitat use and so on. That data is currently in the process of being analyzed now. And Buddy, the ranch dog, took those pictures there. White Ranch. Okay. So the next part of this, I want to talk a little bit about. This is a project we've been involved in for a long time. Is how do horned lizards coexist with people? And this started back in 2013. It was another person from TPW, Ryan Darr. He no longer works with TPW, but he came up and convinced me to go down and check out Kennedy, that there's a lot of horned lizards there. And we did that, and we started a project there. And we worked in Kennedy and Karnes City, so 2 towns in Karnes County. And we've worked there for a number of years now, doing a variety of different projects in those 2 towns. And really it's the students that did all that work. So Ashley originally started looking at genetic diversity and dispersal in those towns. And then that went on to other students like Alexis, where we figured out how to take DNA from horned lizard scat and identify individuals that way. Rachel started doing a diet analysis down there in 2018, and she's taken those skills and now transferred them to the reintroduction site. Daniela Biffy's been working on GIS mapping, and also working on a publication right now on how you can use spot patterns on the belly as an ID, how they're stable over time. And then Stephen Merkin did a predation experiment in town and outside of town. I mentioned that in a little bit. And then Dusty also did some background color matching and found that horned lizards actually are background matched to the soils that they're found on. And now Mary Tucker is currently working on this project, and she did some stuff with mite parasitism, but now is working on thermal ecology of horned lizards in town. So one of the odd things about these towns is that horned lizard density was really high, compared to natural areas. So if you look at this graph here, that red line is what's normally reported to be in natural areas, anywhere from 3 to 10 horned lizards per hectare. And you can see in the gray bars that there's a lot of sites in these two towns that have quite a few more horned lizards. It's average lizard density, and in some cases like School One, there's a ton of lizards in there. And at least in the past there was, there is not now, but we'll talk about that in a second. And so the big question is why, and why were they doing so well, at least in the past in these small towns? And we think we found a variety of answers to this overall question. It's never clear if you can actually answer the question definitively, but we think we found a number of possibilities, I guess I would say. So why are horned lizards so common in these towns? Well, all those students that I just mentioned have found a variety of things. One reason why they probably occur at high density is because they're isolated in town. It looks like they're isolated from horned lizards outside of town genetically. And then that little map that you see up there, you see yellow, green, and red dots. Those are subpopulations of horned lizards in Karnes City. And they're separated by major highways that occur, like Highway 181 separates the red from the yellow and green, and then the Panna Maria Highway separates the yellows from the greens. And we see evidence that there's genetic differentiation across those roads, those major highways, that's comparable to, for instance, genetic differentiation we see between different WMAs in Texas. So really, it was a surprising amount of divergence, actually. And so, of course, if lizards are being isolated in parts of town, they could build up higher densities. Of course, that raises a question as to what are they eating. And what Rachel found, she found a couple of really interesting things. One, they don't eat that many harvester ants in town. There are harvester ants in town, but they don't occur at high enough densities to feed all those lizards that we found. And so what they are eating, though, are these little harvester termites and big-headed ants. And harvester termites are a special termite that occurs in South Texas and some in Central. They come out and they forage on the surface. They don't build little mud tunnels and stuff like desert termites do. So they're available to the horned lizards just like ants, and they eat thousands of them. And they seem to be very good nutritionally for them, as a result. Another thing in those towns that's good for horned lizards is, at least in the past, this is slowly changing, but for the most part, there was pretty good habitat in a lot of people's yards and in alleyways and abandoned lots. A lot of native grass, there wasn't manicured lawns with St. Augustine and stuff like that. There was a lot of shrubbery around, a lot of bare spots as well. You had a lot of native clump grasses in there. And so it was good habitat, a lot of Anaqua in that area. The other thing that seems to be important, and this was an experiment that Stevie Merkin, as well as MR, Mary Rachel did. And we built little model horn lizards out of foam. And we use that kind, it's not a perfect surrogate for studying predation, but it's been used in a lot of studies, making little models. And we put them out in town, all over town, different places, as well as on a nearby ranch in South Texas. And in town, the models didn't get touched. They basically were untouched the whole time. So this was over several sampling periods during a summer. The ones at the ranch, though, just got destroyed. I mean, things were biting them. You can see one there, a picture with one of the heads knocked off. You could see beak marks in the sides. You could see teeth marks in them, and so on. Limbs missing. And, based on kind of our experience looking for horned lizards in those towns, there's really very little avian predators in those towns, like things like road runners and stuff that you would associate with eating horned lizards. There's also very few snakes, surprisingly. And the way we look for horned lizards, you'd think we'd be finding a lot of snakes if there were a lot, but we just don't find many. I mean, all the years that we've looked, we found one co-twit, for instance, in town. I think actually Dusty found that that one year, and we found one bull snake, right? So, it looks like at least some types of predation are really low, and that may explain why they can eat so many small food items and also get to high density in these towns. So one thing we have noticed in town is that when vegetation is removed around the base of trees or along fence rows, in alleyways and so on, basically when stuff gets cleaned up to look nice, the horned lizards leave. I mean, there's just you don't find any, none stay. And, we originally thought, oh, well, maybe it's because they don't have a place to hide from predators. Well, it looks like from the model experiment, maybe that's not as big a deal as we thought. Well, what we do think is a big deal is it degrades the thermal habitat, basically. And so, we've done studies putting out temperature loggers, that's what the little gray model is there, as well as taking temperatures of horned lizards and doing some experiments to determine what their preferred temperature is in these towns. And just a quick little overview of that. The graph you see over on the right, that is the results of the model temperatures averaged over 45 models in 2020. And we would, at each site, we would place them in open areas, in vegetation like bushes, and then also bury just a few centimeter or two underground like they do normally. And the red line is their critical temperature. That's where they'll die if that temperature stays that high. And then the gray bar is their preferred temperature range. And what you can see there is in the open areas in South Texas there's a fair chunk of time in the daytime where temperatures on the ground get above their critical limit, right? I mean, they would not be able to survive out there without having access to vegetation, for instance. And vegetation never gets up even close to that, and these are just, a couple meters away from each other, basically, and, and when we place these models. And so, what we think has happened is when vegetation gets removed in big chunks from areas, when people clean stuff up more or less, wood piles get removed, shrub piles, things like that, that the horned lizards like to utilize, they get too exposed to high temperatures and they're not going to stay in that area. And so we think that that's probably the reason why in areas they've disappeared where there hasn't been, major habitat modification other than just cleaning stuff up, why they've started to disappear in different areas around town. And this happened at School 1, actually. That was kind of a different situation. We would catch about 100 horned lizards a year and this is an elementary school playground, basically. So very bizarre place to have horned lizards. But one year, the lawn keepers decided, yeah, they didn't really want to use weed whackers and stuff like that on the vegetation, so they just nuked it all with herbicides, right? The whole playground. And it did get rid of the vegetation, but it has pretty much gotten rid of all the horned lizards in that area. I mean, we find about one a year now in that area, you know, and it's been about, I don't know, 4 years, I think, since that happened. Yeah, it went from like 100 to down to about 1 now. So yeah, they seem to be very sensitive to, you know, habitat modifications like that, actually. All right, we'll wrap this up, and you know, a lot of people to thank over the years. You know, as Nathan said, this list will just get longer next year, probably in the year after, as more people come on board. A lot of people have funded this as well. TPW, the Horned Lizard Conservation Society. Yes, thank you very much for helping students out with their studies. And yeah, if you're interested in following some of our work, we have Facebook page and Instagram, and you can even get horned lizard t-shirts if you want. All right, so that's it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Yeah, so if anyone has any specific questions, feel free to ask those. If not, Paul Crump from Texas Parks and Wildlife, he is the state herpetologist, has decided to join us for just some general discussion and question. So with that, yeah, if anyone's got any questions, let's go for it.
I have a question for Dean, if I may. Hey, Dean, how's it going?
Hey.
What's going on in West Texas? Those two, that western and that northern clade, come together there. Looks like around Marfa kind of area. Is it like a strong break, or is there some hybridization between the lineages?
There's some hybridization in that area. So we found around, you know, we don't have really dense sampling in there, but along Elephant Mountain and that area, you see a lot of hybridization up through there and up through Alpine and stuff. You know, that's where you start to see the Alpine and Elephant Mountain in that area. So that seems to be the area where they come together, you know, and you do see evidence for hybrids there, but you know, how far that extends, we don't really.
Is it the kind of thing they were separated by a larger area at some point and have come back together? Is it like a secondary contact kind of thing?
Yeah, that's what it seemed like. The NGS work that was done does suggest that was what it was, that, you know, they were separated for quite a while and then came back together in the last, right after the last ice age, basically.
Cool, thanks.
Yeah, and what the barrier was, that, you know, people thought, well, is it a Rio Grande, or maybe it was, you know, there was a large lake in that region, Lake Vaca, I guess it was called, or something. Cabeza de Vaca, that's what it was. that was there during the Pleistocene, basically, but that drained, and then they were able to get back together.
Looks like we've got a question in the comments asking, how far north does the project extend? Becky Trammell asks, says they're located at the Red River. I don't know which specific project, which one are you asking about, Becky?
Just the
Well, that's getting worked out. I have another question, this time for Nathan, if that's all right. Hey, yeah, no. How many adults have you found that are the, you know, the adults of the juveniles that you've released? I know you found hatchlings that you think are, you know, that are the product of, you know, the ones that were released maturing and breeding, how many actual like adult individuals from the ones that have been released have been found? Maybe it's a question for Rachel or one of the other grad students too. I don't know.
I
Who'd be
guess
better for that.
I'll take this since I've been the one that's been doing that. I think in total this year, we probably found about 7 adults in the spring. As far as we know, 2 of them made it to the end of the summer. But several of the juveniles that were released in 2020, we have found that are now adult sized or very close. I think I've found probably like 4 that are pushing adult size already from that release. So I don't know if that answers your question.
I was wondering, and then do you know which release they came from, or is that just kind of hard to tell?
Those 4, yes, because basically, yes, we last year we toe clipped the whole batch, so we knew for sure that this was released in 2020 versus 2021 kind of a deal. But the older ones I found early in the year were not sure exactly when they were released.
Cool. It'd be interesting over time to see what, I imagine the whatever prevailing weather of the year must have such an impact on, the sort of interaction between numbers and whether you get a miserable winter or a super dry summer or something like that.
I think people would probably be happy to know that all of the babies that made it to hibernation last year, that all of them made it through the really bad freeze. And then some. We didn't lose any to that, which was really exciting.
Did that surprise you?
At first it did. But in hindsight, it was kind of like, snow insulates the ground, and then they were kind of usually under vegetation, so there would have been air pocket, and then barely under the soil, so there was probably several layers. And then if you think about how far north they extend up into Kansas and Oklahoma, if they weren't built for that to happen, occasionally they would have gone extinct already. So in hindsight, it's not surprising, but I was definitely worried about it at the time.
That's
And
great.
since we have DNA on all the lizards we've released, Rachel took some toe clips of those 23 hatchlings. So we'll look at parentage on those to see how many, adult male and females produce those clutches. Were they all from different parentage? We should be able to find that out.
And is there capacity, Nathan, to keep kind of, the numbers have been going up every year, right? Is there capacity to just keep increasing the numbers, or is there some sort of like space limit for all the captive facilities?
That's a dying question. I think they've got the space. The one concern they've had is available harvester ants. There's one vendor basically for everybody. So I think last year they had some limitations on what they were getting from that company. So that's a little bit of a concern. But as long as they can get food, they've got the capacity to increase quite a bit. They're actually remodeling a building right there adjacent to where we had the lizards at the zoo. It's one of the old greenhouse buildings. So, the plans are to increase the capacity by quite a bit. So we can feed them. It takes money, obviously, so we got to scrounge up some money going forward. But now that in theory, we're going to keep growing and producing more and more. Not only at the Fort Worth Zoo, but the other zoos that are going to be involved. So hopefully we get a lot more.
So we've got another question in the comments from Becky, which also actually is in line with one of my questions. So she asks, has anyone ever looked at correlation between quail and horned lizard numbers? Which was kind of what I was also thinking is, the way I understand it, they tend to share habitat. If it's good for quail, it's good for horned lizards, at least Texas horned lizards. It's kind of been the rule of thumb, I've been told. So what is there, has anyone looked at it and like from an actual research standpoint? And B, are there any kind of projects meshing those, like conservation projects meshing those together, like in some more whole habitat grassland restoration kind of thing?
I don't think there's been any formal research done on that correlation, but we've absolutely looked at it, and I don't have it handy, but we've looked at, of course, there's a lot of data on quail, populations over time, more than lizards. So we've looked at those cycles over the years and if you look at the kind of cyclical nature of those populations, they really mimic each other pretty closely. So, some of that's tied to, especially in quails, tied to, winter rainfall that produces insects for the poults, so in theory, they probably have some impact on the same thing for prey ability for horn lizards. But yeah, a lot of it goes back to habitat. So they really mirror each other pretty closely. It would be an interesting formal study to do, but kind of anecdotally, yeah, there's a lot of correlation there. And we really preach that message, at least for Parks and Wildlife, because you've got obviously folks like us that are very interested in horn lizards, but you've got a huge, segment out there that's really interested in quail management and quail hunting. So, they're both kind of lures we use to kind of sucker them into the same, for the same benefit, for the same goals. So, whatever, we take that approach for both target audiences to really manage that habitat. So we preach that a lot.
Yeah, I mean, you got to do what you got to do, right? So two things. First, it's 7, so if anyone feels like, obviously no obligation to stay, we can continue discussing if y'all want. I've got another question, so but yeah, anyone else's, feel free to chime in. For those of you who don't want to stay, I really appreciate y'all coming out. I think we've got another talk lined up next month, right, Mason? Maybe.
Yes, we do. So next month will be Dr. Eric McElroy from South Carolina, who's going to be talking about the work that he and his students have done over the past few years about the introduced population of South Carolina that has established there. So it should be really interesting. I hope you all join us. I think that's November 18th, but whatever the third Thursday of the month is.
Cool, thanks. Anyways, so yeah, so I've got another question, if that's okay. So Dean, you were talking about the phylogenetics or the population genetics of the lizards, and I was curious about, so that's based on the modern distribution. So
Right.
historically they extended further east, and when we
Yeah.
say historically, we don't even really mean that far back, right?
Right.
And so do you know what clade those belong to? Do we have access to any specimens that have recoverable DNA? Like, does that make sense?
Yeah, that would be interesting to try that, depending on how they were preserved. We did that with some preserved specimens from the DFW area. They were collected in the 50s and 60s before they disappeared from this area, early 70s, basically. And we looked, and we were curious because we had found a couple of people had reported finding a couple of horn lizards in DFW, and we took DNA samples from the two. And of course, the question is, well, how will we know if they really have the signature or not? That we're able to get genetic samples from the museum specimens. Unfortunately, all these lizards were kept in one big jar. So, there's like 30 of them in a jar of alcohol. And what can happen then is if they're kept in the same jar, DNA can leak basically out in between specimens. So we were able, with cloning and stuff, to get we were able to figure out how many unique genetic types there were. We couldn't really calculate frequencies and stuff because, well, they were all mixed in there. But the signature we got from that was pretty much similar to the northern clade. And the signature that we got from the two lizards that were found here were southern, like strongly southern. So what they were is basically people had brought them up here and, they got loose or something. Now, we have looked at horn lizards in like Smithville and Rockdale. There were populations there, because that would have probably been more the eastern region where they used to be, and more numerous. And it looks like lizards in those towns are also a mix of stuff from the north, some stuff from the south. There's some unique signature in there. We don't know if that's, due to what used to be there a long time ago, or if, it's just people let them go there and they got established. That's kind of what it looks like a little bit. But
Right.
so, yeah, I don't know. Ultimately, that would be very interesting to see. My guess is the southern population really is what's going to go over more east, because it's below the Edwards Plateau.
Right.
And so, yeah.
Cool. Yeah, so if anyone else has any questions. If not, I have one last question, if that's okay. I don't want to just be like the single voice for everybody, but I'll do it if I have to. And I guess this is for our esteemed state herpetologist. So we mostly talk about Texas horn lizards, right? But we've got 3 species in Texas. How are those other 2? How are they doing?
Great question, Dalton. We just added the roundtail to the SGCN list, so that we could spend a bit of time kind of figuring out what was going on with it. Adding it to the SGCN list, I think it's, nobody's ever looked at it. We've never done a status assessment or anything like that. And I think there's enough concern about kind of illegal commercial collection and all, the sort of standard suite of threats that affect the genus, to stick it on there for now. And when we get to do the assessment, that'll give us a better sort of baseline for moving forward. We're changing over the process, well, not really the process, the structure that we use to designate SGCNs at this, which is kind of species of greatest conservation need. Sorry, I'm slipped straight into like government acronyms immediately. So those SGCNs are the species of greatest conservation need. They're the ones that go into the Texas Conservation Action Plan, the TCAP, of course. And those are the species that are kind of eligible for state wildlife grant funding. So sticking the roundtail on the list makes it eligible for a whole bunch of resources and things that, that it wouldn't have been when it wasn't on the list, including our time thinking about it. So we'll do a status assessment to figure out, where it needs to go moving forward. We did a updated status assessment for the greater shorthorn, whatever its common name is, back in 2018. I think Leslie's on here. Leslie was a sort of important driving force behind collecting information on that, and I think that one came out as it's like an S2, which is, according to the sort of system we use, I think that's kind of imperiled in the state because of its limited distribution. But there's been some really interesting observations of that species pop up on iNaturalist over the last couple of years, and some sort of new mountain ranges at lower elevations and things that we were aware of previously. So that's, that species is the kind of one, it's like, it's got a gigantic range outside of Texas. Are we going to throw any resources at that one, or is this going to be one that we kind of mess around with on the side? And, when we're at snake days, if that ever happens again, kind of, go drive up in the mountains and see if we can still see them in the places where they were and all that stuff. So yeah, I think so the roundtail is definitely on our radar for kind of seeing if it needs, see what its needs are in the future.
Cool. Awesome for that summary. Thank you. Yeah, so if Leslie has she says she can't unmute, but she's got her hand raised. She said that she's volunteered to do a project similar to the greater shorthorn on the roundtail. So that's in the works, I guess.
Fantastic.
Awesome.
Thank you, Leslie. Yes.
All right. So yeah, if no one else has any questions, we can go ahead and dismiss this. I really appreciate everyone showing up. Hope everyone had a good time. I thought it was fun. It's nice to actually hear some talks again. So, but yeah, so hopefully we see everybody next month.
Thank you, Dalton. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.